Good afternoon. This is Mike Fowler with the World Trade Center Tacoma, and welcome to this joint program by the World Trade Center Tacoma and the World Affairs Council Tacoma. In today's program, we'll look at the impact of Biden's China policy on business and trade with our guest, Sam Kaplan. Sam is currently the director of the Center of Excellence for Global Trade and Supply Chain Management. He worked with China for over 30 years, 20 of those as a veteran and former president of the Trade Development Alliance of Greater Seattle. Sam is author of the very recently released Challenging China: Smart Strategies for Dealing with China in the Xi Jinping Era. Before we start, I'd like to thank our partners in this event, the World Affairs Council of Tacoma, for being a great partner and co-organizer. Also, I'd like to thank the World Trade Center sponsors, the Port of Tacoma, the Tacoma Pierce Chamber of Commerce, and the City of Tacoma. Moreover, a special thanks to our event co-promotional sponsors, the Asia Pacific Culture Center and the Chinese Reconciliation Park Foundation. Please note that any opinions expressed during this program do not reflect the positions of the World Trade Center, of Tacoma, the World Trade Center Tacoma, the World Affairs Council Tacoma, or any sponsor or partner organization. Let me also note that the World Trade Center Tacoma is a business association, and this program is part of the World Affairs Council's Global Impact series that focuses on business and economics. And the great majority of you out there, over 100 registered today, are business people. And from your questions, from your many questions, I see that you're looking for answers as to where we are and what's ahead for trade and business with China. And that's where we'll focus. Realistically, our time is limited, and this is a huge topic. But Sam will be a guest at an event on April 28th at the Washington State China Relations Council. Please watch for it. And feel free to write questions in the chat box. We'll do our best to get to them, prioritizing those on business and trade. And I'll intersperse your questions with my own. First, let's talk about the Chinese economy. To put it in perspective, according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund's latest estimates, the country will be the main engine for global growth from this year through 2026, accounting for more than a fifth of the world's total economic expansion. Sam, you don't seem to worry about this. Rather, in your chapter explaining the economy is not a pie but a bakery, it's almost as if you're celebrating it. What do you mean?
Yeah, so I have concerns about China, but one of them is not that they've been growing their economy. It's been one of the great things for the world. And by the way, hello everybody, and thanks for having me. And looking forward to talking to everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces here on Zoom. Maybe soon I'll be able to see people in person. But yeah, I do believe the economy is a bakery, not a pie. And China's growth over the last 40 years has been a good thing, obviously, for China and for Chinese people. It's brought 700 million people out of absolute poverty. And along with a lot of other countries that have grown during the last 50 years, we've seen more people get out of absolute poverty than at any other time in human history. And that is a good thing. I also think it's been good for the world, just like it was good that Japan grew economically after World War II, and Taiwan and South Korea and other Asian tigers and other countries. It's a good thing. Now, China's growth economically had some discrete geographical impacts in the United States and in other countries, but overall it meant an increase in jobs, not just in China, but around the world and even in the United States. And certainly it was helpful to consumers as well. So China's growing is a good thing. And not who am I to take issue with IMF, but I actually am surprised the IMF is projecting that way because although I think China has done a great job, I think they're facing more difficult economic challenges going forward. I do not think they will have the economic growth that they've had the last 30 years in the next 5 to 6 years. I think this year they might because of COVID catch up. You're catching up from a depressed economy and having some rapid growth. But I will guess that the United States has a chance to have more of an impact on growth over the next 5, 6 years than China will. I don't think China's going to crash, but I think they're not going to grow as fast as they have in recent years.
Speaking of the United States and China and business and trade competition, um, how do you feel about competition in business and trade? Is it something that is a positive or a negative?
Well, I view competition as good and in all sorts of ways. Now, there's challenges with China's economy that in some ways their economy is still closed. Well, in many ways, their economy is still closed. They're still providing subsidies to state-owned enterprises, and there's a lot of non-tariff barriers and other problems. And they're still stealing IP, although they're protected more than it used to, partly because there's a lot more Chinese companies with IP to be protected. So they've grown in that way. But I do think competition is helpful. The more Chinese scientists who can provide life-saving cures or other types of technology, the better. The more Chinese artists who can be successful, the better. The more Chinese products that can be helpful to the world, the better for the world. And that'll, I think, already so with America, I think you're already seeing it have an impact on us. We get very worried about China, and in my opinion, rightly so for a variety of reasons, but it's also pushing us to try and improve our own country. And you see us trying to do things on a variety of industry sectors with the Biden administration trying to support them in a variety of other ways that we're trying to make sure our country is more successful. So in that sense, competition is probably helping America to become a better country.
Right, right. And I read in your book that we do need to be more successful, and especially for our businesses. Where can you outline a little bit the the areas that you mentioned, infrastructure, healthcare, etc.,
Oh,
that are
yeah.
important to improve?
In my book, I lay out a variety of foreign policy things I think we should do in deal with China under Xi Jinping. But I say the most important thing we need to do is to improve our own country. And I'll give a couple of examples. I won't give all the ones from the book. But one is infrastructure. I think Biden announced his big infrastructure law last week or the week before last. I think that's fine, that's great, but I actually talk about infrastructure, not so much that we need to build a bunch more and spend a bunch more money. I tackle it from the area that we are much more expensive to build infrastructure in America and takes much longer than it does in, say, the EU or Japan or other comparable places, with no commensurate benefits to the environment or to labor. It costs maybe 2 to 3 times more to build infrastructure, whether transit or highways or other public infrastructure than in Europe and in Japan. And that's a big problem. And it also takes much longer. In fact, in the book, I use a Tacoma example. I talk about the I-5 construction that's been going on, 8 years or so, and costing a huge amount of money. I have my in-laws live in the Tacoma area. So pre-pandemic times, I used to drive down there all the time. And you would think that Seattle should be the worst traffic, right? Because it's a much bigger place. But Tacoma often be the worst traffic, and it's because of construction that's been going on for years and years and costing lots of money. We need to figure out how to reduce the cost of infrastructure and do it much more efficiently for a variety of reasons, for being more competitive, also for the environment. I think how much more we could deal with climate change if we were able to build transit for much less cost and more quickly, or EV stations for when electric cars come and things like that. I think I'm going to forget the number for Biden's infrastructure bill. Was it $2 billion, something like that? If we were able to have the costs of Japan and Europe and still, again, have the same protections for the environment, which they do, and protections for labor, we'd be able to build twice as much than what we're saying we want to build for that money. So that's one of the places I recommend in trying to improve our own country.
I think you're right, Sam, but I think you got something wrong. There's traffic in Tacoma because Tacoma is the center of the world. It's where the west sound meets the east sound and heads to the south, to Mexico.
That
Anyways,
is an excellent point. A good correction.
what about healthcare?
Yeah, I talk about healthcare reform in the book as well. And I'm not a healthcare expert, but a couple years ago, I used my personal story where I had some knee problems and went through this crazy process of getting my knee replaced twice in the space of 2 years of great expense. Um, and I think anyone who's that's not unusual. I think we've all had crazy dealings with the healthcare world, and it's just sort of like infrastructure. We pay a lot more for healthcare with no better results than other countries, and it's much more inefficient. And you talked about competition. We've managed to combine the worst of socialism with the worst of capitalism into our healthcare system. We don't really have good competition in our healthcare system. I'd much rather that we did and had a social safety net that was not causing problems for individuals, but at the same time had competition for the companies that are involved in healthcare. We've managed to somehow have both socialism and the worst aspects of capitalism in our healthcare system. And so, yeah, that's the second place where I recommend trying to improve our own country.
Got it. Got it. Let's get into some questions on opportunities. Kim asked, is doing business in China moving forward viable and or wise for a small company?
I think that it is. It's it's difficult to do business in China, as anyone knows, and it's probably more difficult to do business in China now than it was, say, 5, 6 years ago. In some ways, again, if you're dealing with something with IP, you might have a better chance now to get your intellectual property protected than you did 5, 6 years ago. But at the same time, China is protecting more industries. Uh, they are wanting to, under the dual circulation policy, which there's a lot of different interpretations of what that means. But essentially, they want to continue to be able to export, but also build up certain parts of their domestic industries and more consumption in their country. Really, what country wouldn't want to do that, I suppose, right? America would probably like to do that as well. But in trying to do that, they're again protecting different industries. So if you're trying to be if you're a small business trying to do business in China, you want to look at the dual circulation policy and look at the different places they're trying to protect and to build up their domestic industries, as well as the Made in China 2025 strategic plan, which is something similar pre the dual circulation policy. Again, you can look all this up and see where the areas that they're trying to build up domestic. If it's an area that you're in, it may be more difficult for you. Although if you're supplying a part that they don't have yet, that might be at least a short-term opportunity for you. If it's an area they're not trying to protect, then I think there's still plenty of room for small businesses to be successful in China. There's even Tacoma businesses that, of course, have been successful for many years and continue to be successful in China.
Right. And also, from the perspective of the World Trade Center, we have upcoming virtual trade missions with the sister cities of Tacoma and Seattle. And our partner organizations over there are very capable and very helpful for, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. And with today's technology, it is amazing how easy it is to connect. Um, Much easier than it was, say, 40 years ago when I started and you needed a teletype machine. So Karen asks, um, in what areas do you expect an expansion of trade under Biden that will directly lead to more South Sound jobs?
Well, it's a great question. We're early in the Biden administration. I would guess that the Biden administration will try and support the ag industry, which will help Tacoma in the sense of more stuff hopefully going through the ports, Northwest Seaport Alliance, and of course the Port of Tacoma specifically. And that'll be a boon. Well, I know we're going to talk about tariffs later, but there's been challenges for agriculture because of that. I think also the infrastructure bill hopefully will help our ports in that sense as well, including rail and roads and other ways so we can get things to and from the ports. For other sectors, I don't know if I have my crystal ball out to say exactly which sectors are going to work, but again, I'd look at the Made in China 2025 plan and the dual circulation plan and look for sectors that are not going to be protected by China. And I think there's places where we can do that, where local areas can be successful. I know we're going to talk a little bit about Biden's trade policy in general and how that'll affect things. So maybe I'll stop there on that question.
Okay, great. Well, we have a lot of questions on trade policy and tariffs. Um, let's start with Bruce's question. Please explain 301 tariffs.
Well, so the 301 tariffs is from when I think I was back working in DC many years ago originally, and so the Trump administration used the 301 law. It's a section of a trade law to impose tariffs in China. Something we should remember is that the Trump administration imposed tariffs originally on countries all over the world, both competitors, foes, and allies alike. We had tariffs on the EU. We had tariffs in Japan. He was threatening, just as he was leaving office, to put tariffs on Vietnam. So those are in place, and I don't agree with them, and I don't think they helped. It was followed on by a U.S.-China trade deal that the Trump administration negotiated that basically set a baseline of, I want to say it's $200 billion that China would have to buy above the 2019 baseline. I may not have the exact date or a dollar figure, but something like that. And that's because the Trump administration was very focused on trade deficits, the trade balance. They really weren't even focused on opening the China market or trying to deal with IP so much. Trump, at least himself, was singularly focused on the trade deficit. And so this US-China trade agreement, it was asking China and forcing China to buy a certain number of goods, which theoretically would reduce the trade deficit. Now, COVID-19 happened during that time or right after that. And of course, demand was diminished because of COVID-19, and the world economy changed a lot, at least temporarily. And China is not going to make those baseline goals that were in that trade deal. In fact, the trade deficit has grown since then. So the tariffs have been ineffective, and they were really not, the reason that Trump expressed for this, the trade deficit, was not the right target to begin with. We definitely do need to open the China market and deal with some of their mercantile policies, but the trade deficit itself is really something on the side. The Biden administration has talked about trying to do a more multilateral approach. They have not yet taken off the tariffs, and we'll have to see what happens with that going forward. But right now, the tariffs that the Trump administration had in place are still in place under the Biden administration.
In your last conversation with Anthony Blinken, when did he say he would move?
Yeah, that's right. He's on speed dial on my cell phone over here. I don't know what they're going to do, but I think it's instructive they haven't done anything yet. My presumption and what you read is that they're going to use, well, three things. One, I think there's political reasons. There's no reason for the Biden administration to just suddenly take off the tariffs and get a political hit domestically from it. Two, I think they want to use it for leverage. They want to try and get something out of China. Now, what that is, I don't know. And what they're going to try and push for, I don't know. Whether it's going to be some real things around IP or opening up the market in different places in China, I don't know. Or maybe they're going to use it for things around climate change. The climate summit is happening right now that the White House is involved in. And John Kerry was just in China. I think he just left China, or maybe he's still there. So there could be a number of things, but the presumption is that they're using it for leverage, but they have not yet taken off the tariffs, I think is indicative that they're going to continue to use it for leverage. So what they'll get and when they'll get it, I don't know, but they're obviously using it for leverage.
Got it. We have a interesting question from Hans. What is the likelihood and what are the consequences of total decoupling from China?
Well, you can define that a number of different ways. If he means the world decoupling from China, I would say 0 chance. If he means just the United States,
I think it's probably the U.S. is my guess.
Yeah, so if he means the United States completely decoupling from China, I would say 0.1/10 of a chance, and not much greater. But the thing to remember about decoupling is in recent years, the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of, not a lot, there's been some politicians and some policy advocates calling for decoupling from China because of China's behavior in a variety of different areas. But the thing to remember is that China started decoupling from the United States long before we even started talking about we should decouple from China. You saw that with the internet as they put up the Great Firewall. That is a form of decoupling. With the protection of different industries and making it impossible in certain areas to be able to do business in China, that's a decoupling. You know, Amazon.com is not successful in China because Amazon is a dumb company. They're obviously the exact opposite. China protected that industry and allowed domestic companies to grow in that. So the first thing to remember is that decoupling started from the China side. There's now some calling for decoupling in response to various Chinese actions and behavior. I don't call for that in my book. First, because I don't think it would be possible, right? If the United States decoupled, you're not going to get the rest of the world decoupling. So all you'd be doing is helping other countries' companies be successful economically and hurting US companies. And I bet you'd have some US companies move out of the country to try and deal with that, or at least do some sort of corporate structures that allow them to get around it. And second, there's really no historical evidence that decoupling works in changing a country's behavior. If decoupling was so effective, then Cuba would be a democracy right now, and they're not. In fact, the last of the Castros is just finally apparently leaving the scene, but still with a dictatorship. Or North Korea. North Korea is essentially decoupled, and we haven't changed North Korea that way. Or Iran. I haven't seen Iran completely changed because of decoupling. Iran's a little more complicated than those other two countries. In fact, that they do have some democracy in their country. But it just has not been effective in the past. If I thought that decoupling would suddenly change China, then I would probably call for it. But there's no evidence whatsoever that it would be effective.
Timothy asks a question here. Do you see relations with the Chinese as it relates to manufacturing / business improving or continuing to go downhill? Have we bottomed out?
Well, it's a great question. I think rather than saying either or good or bad or bottoming out is that I think it'll continue to change, and change not for a variety of reasons. One, it'll change for non-political reasons. It'll change because of China's economy and already has been changing. China's become more expensive. Labor has become more expensive. I was in Vietnam in 2019 and toured a shoe factory there. Well, 5 years before that, that shoe factory was in southern China, and then they moved to Vietnam. So this was 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So well before Trump was president, well before the US-China trade war, they moved because it was becoming too expensive to do what they do with the shoes in China. And so they went to a lower cost place, but that was also capable, developed capabilities to produce these shoes. And I think you saw that, and then it accelerated some with the US-China trade war, where you saw things like that moving from China to other places. Vietnam, I think you're seeing some of that to Africa as well, which is an undertold story. And then the US-China trade war maybe accelerated that. And then COVID-19 hit, and people got a little bit worried about supply chains, and that they didn't want to have all their eggs in one basket. So I think you'll continue to see diversification out of China and just in general. Although, if I could get on my soapbox for 1 minute on globalization, you see a lot of people criticizing globalization over the last year and even before that. But people talking about, oh, I keep reading these stories about COVID-19 has shown how fragile the globalized economy is. They're leaving out a clause when they say that. You've seen some fragilities coming out of COVID-19 and globalization, but you have to ask yourself, compared to what? If every country was just building their own products and their own vaccines and their own everything, that would be far more fragile than this global supply chain that we have now, where we don't have all our eggs in one basket. I think we have learned we need to spread out the supply chain a little bit more than it is, but to say that globalization is fragile, it's really not true. And in fact, I do a weekly newsletter, International Need to Know, and this week I wrote about the vaccine supply chain. If you look at the ingredients for vaccines, they come from all over the world, and not just China. They're from all sorts of places: Mexico, Switzerland, the United States, Germany, all sorts of places. And the development of the vaccine that was not just American innovation, these new mRNA vaccines, that came from both immigrants and from people in different parts of the world. So globalization actually is what is saving us from the pandemic. It's not the thing that's causing us to make it a more fragile world. That's my high horse that I'll be on for today. I'll be trying to be more reasonable the rest of the program.
But I thought you were a protester at the WTO protests in Seattle.
That's right. I was actually booed at the WTO protest. I think that's the only time I've ever been booed in my life.
Well, anyways, I heard stories about that. You were caught in the thick of things there.
Yeah, I was.
Bruce asks a question. Uh, is the goal of Biden's China policy to get the U.S. and the Pacific Northwest back to where things were pre-Trump, or to advance things?
Well, even if he wanted to get things to pre-Trump, it wouldn't be possible. The world has completely changed in the last 4 years. When Biden was vice president, he can't go back to that time. We're in a different era due to the Trump administration, due to China, and due to other countries. Uh, the US ceded world leadership during those 4 years, and the rest of the world adjusted to that and moved on in many ways. They there was a supply chain coalition that Japan, India, and Australia is trying to build. Japan and Vietnam's defense ministers have been meeting to talk about different security arrangements. So even if Biden wanted to move back to 2016 when he was vice president, it wouldn't be possible. And just to show I'm an equal opportunity attacker, the Biden administration is right now having its first foreign policy disaster, and that would be in vaccines. We've been hoarding vaccines in the United States. We've been have a variety. We've been hoarding ingredients as well, and you're now seeing a second wave in India. You're seeing cases go up in Cambodia and a variety of other places. So there's a very good chance in 2021 that more people will die from COVID-19 than in 2020. And let that sink in. So in a year when we have vaccines, more people may die of COVID than in the year when we did not have vaccines. And that is a choice by the rich countries of the world. That did not have to happen. The United States and other countries could spend right now billions of dollars, so it would be cost money, but it would save hundreds of thousands of lives, and economically it'd save trillions of dollars. So it's really the easiest cost benefit decision that anyone could ever make in the history of the world. In our country, the Biden administration so far is making the wrong decision, as are other countries. I don't even remember now what the question was, but I do what the Biden administration is going to do. So we can't go back to 2016. My sense is what he's going to do, and he's said what he's going to do, is try and be more competitive with China and build a multilateral coalition, deal with China on issues that we have concerns of, whether it's human rights, economic closures, or other things. And so I think he's trying to build that multilateral approach. It won't be easy, though. That's not going to be an easy thing to do, but I think that's the approach that they will take.
Right. Well, this brings in Victor's question. If you had to say one major change that we'll see in the Biden administration, what will it be going forward?
Well, I think multilateral, so that at least change from the Trump administration. So the Trump administration was all about bilateral, not just with China, but with the whole world. You know, they pulled out of TPP and they wanted to negotiate a variety of bilateral negotiations. The U.S.-China trade agreement was obviously bilateral, and they really did everything in a competition that was one-on-one. The Biden administration is going to try and do more multilateral efforts. I do also, we don't need to get into because I know this is a business forum. I do think the other changes, the Biden administration will emphasize human rights more. So I think those will be the two big changes.
Got it. Now, there's education is a services export, and a big one, especially in our area. We have lots of universities here, and so let's change the focus onto education. Paul, an educator at POU, asks, how can we in higher education best advocate for improved U.S.-China relations. There's a similar question coming from Daniel, having to do with right now, is anything going to change with the Biden administration in terms of foreign students coming from China?
Well, I hope so. So yeah, as you smartly say, Mike, the education is an important economic aspect as well as there are other aspects to it. But international students are a great export of the United States. I'm going to forget the number for Washington State, but it's something like $600 million export for Washington State alone for international students. And a lot of those students in recent years have been Chinese. I think there were, at least in 2019, there were over 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. And that is good economically for us, but it's also good, I think, in terms of the competition with China that people talk about. And also in my, I advocate for trying to encourage liberalization in China. I think it's good for these students to come here and study, to see a different country, to see the differences and to see both the good and bad of America and to interact with people in a free way that they can here in the United States. So that's good, but it's also good for our students. Again, globalization is not going away. In fact, I think it'll become even more pronounced in the coming years. So American students need to understand the world, including and especially China, and the more interactions they have with Chinese peers, the better. So in terms of trying to work with the Biden administration, I think it's important to encourage that we encourage more students to come here. There, there's for the Commerce Department, there's people who specialize in education that are in our embassies and consulates all over the world. So making sure they up their game to try and encourage international students to come to the United States from China and other places. I will note that in Vietnam, again, where I was in 2019, and under the Trump administration, about 50%, about half of the requested visas from Vietnamese students were rejected. And the data appeared to show that was the case in many places. I could not get all the data, but from what I heard, it was the case for any non-white country under the Trump administration that 50% of visas were being rejected, which is just crazy. So we can start approving these visas and allowing more students to come from China, from Vietnam, and from all these different countries, I think would be good for our country economically, socially, and good for those countries as well. And I encourage us to free up our immigration so that these people who study here can stay here and work and become US citizens. The United States, there's lots of countries, there are democracies now in the world. There are lots of countries that have different types of constitutions, but the United States is still probably the country that is at least one of, if not the most successful at integrating people from around the world when they move here. With all of our problems that we have in this country, including a lot of racist problems that we have in the country, we're still better than just about any other country at doing that. And it's helped our economy and our country tremendously. I think 50% of CEOs in Silicon Valley are foreign born. And in the United States as a whole, it's a very large percentage of CEOs are foreign born. They create jobs, they create products, they create all sorts of things for our country. So we need to encourage and continue to have more immigration into the country. I know it's not always a popular opinion to say that, but I think it's a real key to being successful going forward.
Got it. Let's reverse this question a little bit. Speaking of education, also speaking of Pacific Lutheran University, PLU, who I mentioned earlier, it brings to mind the declining state of our Chinese language education in this country. Interest has been waning in it since 2011, and it's hard to argue that language is not critical for business and trade. Having said that, I also know that Pacific Lutheran University took over the University of Washington's Confucius Institute, which I understand you were involved in the establishment of. What are your thoughts about the Confucius Institute?
Yeah, so I am one of the founders of the Confucius Institute in Washington State. It came about in 2006 when President Hu came to Seattle. A guy named Scott Heinlein, who at the time worked for the Washington State China Relations Council, suggested we should get a Confucius Institute and we should talk to President Hu and his people when they came. And we decided with a group of people to try and make it the first statewide Confucius Institute. Most are sort of cities wide, and we tried to make it Washington statewide. We talked to Governor Gregoire. I worked with Scott and some other people to put together some briefing materials for her. She talked to President Hu, and they agreed to do a Confucius Institute. After a little bit of time, we got that. It was based at the University of Washington, and then the Seattle School District was part of it, and it was supposed to be a statewide and did some statewide stuff. And the Confucius Institutes, a lot of what they do is they bring in teachers to teach Chinese language, and the Chinese pay for that, and they send these Chinese language teachers. So there were teachers here that taught at I think it was West Seattle High School and some other places here in the state, and they're teaching Chinese language. Now, there's been some controversies, some discrete areas where there was worries, and in fact, there was propaganda that happened, but that was only in a few different places with Confucius Institutes. For the most part, they're teaching them the different tones in Chinese and teaching them how to speak the language and how to do the characters. And that was certainly the case here. In fact, the only controversy with our Confucius Institute that I ever came across was unfortunately one of the teachers that came here was a victim of a crime here. Like they were robbed, as I recall. And so I was pulled in to get involved with that. Um, Now we do want, and it's just not my anecdotal experience. There's been a couple of different studies that have found that it's overblown the concerns about the propaganda part of the Confucius Institutes. Now we should keep an eye on that when they do happen. We should quash that. But the Confucius Institutes can be a useful tool to try and get more language training into our schools and more traditional Chinese culture training. That's the other part that they do as well. Uh, as far as there's less demand for foreign languages and for Chinese in particular, that's been an ongoing problem. And I gather in the last 3 or 4 years, there's less demand for Chinese learning in particular. We should try and battle that. Even if you're a hawk on China, it seems to me you'd want more people who can speak Mandarin and understand China than less. We need more people like that in the United States. So no matter where you fall in China, hawk or dove or in between, it would be good to encourage more people to learn Chinese language and culture and have a better understanding of China.
The Chinese have a saying, 知己知彼. Uh, it's modified slightly. I mean, it means how can you modify it generally means you have to know yourself and also know your competitor. And so it doesn't make any sense that Chinese would not be very interesting to people wanting to do business in the future. And I hope that it continues to be something people want to study. And I do believe that there's been changes in organization that now the curriculums are for the Confucius Institutes are controlled by the schools, and this was a change.
Yeah, I should add that it moved from UW to PLU because under the Trump administration, they would have lost federal funds if they kept the Confucius Institute. So there's a reason why it's moved. And PLU is involved with the Confucius Institute from the very beginning as well. So it's a good place for it to be. And I'm sure they're doing good work down there.
Great. Okay, Carl asks the question, manufacturing and importing from China have become drastically more expensive in the past year. The renminbi is up more than 10%, shipping has doubled. Do you see this stabilizing this year? Do you feel we're downplaying inflation based on China costs?
Well, as someone who had their bathroom remodeled the last few months, I've seen the supply chain up close. Some of the expenses, it's become more expensive, and also our bathroom is done except for the bathroom faucet, which is not going to arrive for like another 2 months.
It's probably sitting out on a container ship, the port of LA.
That's and that was my book as well. My book originally was going to come out April 6th, but that's exactly right. My book was stuck on a container ship outside the port of LA, port of Long Beach, waiting to come into port because there's been so much demand for goods coming in from China and from other
I'm
places.
glad it's not one of those that fell into the ocean.
No, it survived. Fortunately, it's now in your bookstore and at Amazon. So yeah, but it was delayed because of the supply chain. The supply chain has had hiccups this year. China, so far in 2021, appears to be growing more broadly. They claimed a lot of growth in 2020, but a lot of that really was in the cities, and they were struggling a lot in the rural areas. It seems to be that the rural areas are catching up more now. At least I followed China Beige Book, which is a great resource on economic data in China. And according to them, that appears to be the case. Um, but services is still not as robust as one might hope. So I think I'm hopeful that the world economy will rebalance some this year, but that'll partly be dependent on getting people vaccinated all over the world, going back to my earlier rant. So if the United States gets itself vaccinated, and it's not clear that'll be the case, we have plenty of supply, but we're now running into a demand problem with vaccine hesitancy. But if we do get ourselves vaccinated to a certain level, that won't solve the world economy, won't even solve our economy completely. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. I have business stuff I want to do in Vietnam, but I'm not going to be able to get to Vietnam unless Vietnam is able to get vaccinated. And then people who are doing business in other parts of the world, none of our economies completely come back. In fact, China kind of learned this last year. They did a little bit of victory lap on their success in containing COVID-19, and they did successfully contain COVID-19. But their economy had problems, as I said last year, and that's partly because the rest of the world was having problems. So none of us get out of this until all of us get out of this. Uh, but I do think we will eventually, and I'm hoping we'll come to our senses and get out of it sooner by helping the rest of the world with vaccinations more robustly than we are currently. And then I think we'll have things adjust more. But I do think China's economy is going to change. I alluded to it earlier. This year, I think they might have high GDP growth from COVID-19 catch up, but they're not going to have the 7, 8, 9% growth they've had in the past after that. I think they'll have growth that's much more similar to what Europe and America are going to have. And that's for a couple of reasons. So remember that GDP growth comes from two things. It comes from an increase in workers, and it comes from an increase in productivity. Well, the workforce of China is now declining. Their demographics, they're aging, and actually in another 20 years, they'll have older demographics than the United States, or maybe even sooner. So they already have a decrease in the number of workers in China, and that's one headwind for GDP growth. And then productivity, their productivity increases have been larger than, for example, America's and some other countries, but the rate of increase of productivity has been decreasing. So I think they're going to have a challenge there going forward as well. So now it's not a catastrophe necessarily. Japan, even the Japan lost decade, if you look at GDP per capita, that kept going up. But I think it'll be a different Chinese economy than it has the last 30 years. So
Uh,
it's something to think about.
Speaking of economy and Chinese economy and statistics, Karen is asking, how could you please spell out the name of the book with great Chinese economic data?
It's about the name of.
There's a book with
It's not a
great
book. It's a business service called China Beige Book.
beige,
Beige book.
beige as in the color.
Yeah, correct. Kind of like the
China
Fed
beige.
has a Fed Beige Book for the United States. This is a private company that has really good data on China, in my opinion. And I'm not paid by them to say that. This is just a honest appraisal
Right.
of it.
And do you know how to spell beige?
Beige. I don't know how to
Very
spell
good.
it in Chinese,
Very
so
good.
I'll leave that to you, Mike.
Okay. I think it's, I don't know how it would be, Fen, Fenchhouse, I'm guessing. Anyways, um, we have questions on electric vehicles. How rapidly is China planning to transition to electric vehicles? Having purchased an electric vehicle from China uh, more than 10 years ago, before we had electric vehicles, I want to just take a shot at that. I know that 50% of the vehicles by 1930 by 2035 must be quote unquote new energy vehicles, electric, plug-ins, hybrid or fuel cell powered, and 95% of those uh, are to be electric. This is the stated goal in China, and also further to that, and further to a comment, one of the questions and comments that came in having to do with coal powered plants in China. Uh, Xi President Xi has mentioned that the goal of carbon neutrality has been set for 2060. Um, and so you'll hear a lot more of that in the next 5-year plan, but that was mentioned recently. So 95% of the half of new energy vehicles, which is the requirement, the goal by 2035 will be electric. So I was whenever I go to China, I look at new electric vehicles. They have all kinds of electric vehicles, various um, sophistication, from very inexpensive to very luxurious. If you want to take a look at something, I think it's called Hi-Fi, HIPHI, a new electric vehicle that just came out. That the back doors open like a lotus. It's pretty interesting and sophisticated. You might want to take a look at that.
Back to the
Anyway,
future. Uh,
Sam, what about electric vehicles? What's your thoughts on that?
well, that's great information, Mike. And I'll just add a couple of things. Is one is I think there's an electric revolution that's coming more quickly than people believe. We've made remarkable progress in electric generation. When I say we, scientists have, and also policymakers who helped subsidize it in Germany and elsewhere to create it to happen. So that it's now cheaper. So it's great to have electric vehicles, but especially in China, it depends how you're charging them, right? So if you're charging them and you're getting electricity from coal-powered plants, you're not creating as much help for the environment as you think you are. But the electric generation there's solar power has become so cheap that in many parts of the world now it's much cheaper to build a solar um, plant than it is to build a coal plant and even natural gas plants. So that's happening, and then we're making huge strides in battery. So you can generate the energy, but you also have to store it, and that's obviously an important thing for cars. So there's a lot of cars now that are going to have much longer ranges. So I honestly think in the next 5 years, there's a chance to really transform the vehicle environment, no pun intended. It'll require policy making as well. I think the Biden administration's infrastructure bill talks about trying to create the charging stations infrastructure that we may need. China, I think, will have an advantage there because they can create infrastructure much more quickly than we can. Although unlike Europe and Japan, they don't do it with all the labor and environmental protections. So I don't think we should be modeling our reform of infrastructure in China. We should be modeling it on looking at other countries like in Europe and in Japan. But nonetheless, they will be able to build infrastructure quickly, which will give them advantage. The other thing to think about, though, is I talked about the dual circulation policy and the protection of the Chinese market. Tesla, which has been making a big bet in China, they've been running into some problems even in the last couple of weeks. They've been getting attacked in the Global Times, the big official newspaper in China, just in the last couple of days. I think there was a Tesla crash in China, similar to that would happen here this week.
Right. I think the complainant wanted a full refund and went to a trade show or something and made an issue of it, and
Yeah,
they got arrested.
but it's also possible that China is going to protect that industry just like they have other industries. I know I'm forgetting afraid of his name. There's the Chinese electric vehicle company, and the CEO was asked about Jack Ma recently, and he quickly walked away from the camera because he did not want to end up like Jack Ma. So there's both a lot of positives. I think the electric revolution is coming quicker than people realize. It'll take some government policy in various countries to make it really come to fruition. but the technology and the science has changed much more quickly than people realize.
Here's a question, interesting question from Luis. And will will the Chinese replace the U.S. in terms of exports to Latin American countries?
Uh, I don't know what the mix is now. China's the biggest trader in the world currently. It's another reason why people talk about decoupling. I just don't think it's realistic. Or people want to treat China like the Soviet Union. China is very different from the Soviet Union in that they're much more enmeshed in the world economy than the Soviet Union ever was.
Right.
Well, I don't know what China's exports are to Latin America compared to the United States. I know Mexico is one of the United States' largest trade partners. I presume we're doing much better with Mexico, but in terms of the rest of Latin America, I'm not sure. It'll be really interesting to see. It'll be partly dependent on how supply chains change and how people want them to change. Like I say, people are wanting to diversify more. It'll also, shippers really care about two things: time and money. So it'll depend on how markets develop. If the Mexico market, which for a while was doing very well, and then the last 4 years has had a little bit more difficulty, and they've got a populist in power now, like we had a populist in power. If the Mexico market develops, if Brazil, which also has a populist in charge and is also having lots of COVID problems and other problems, if things change there and they develop, it's a large market. And there is a variety of papers that show trade is more abundant by closer geographies. So you would think that the United States would have an advantage there, and the Latin American countries we would all be trading more closely with each other. But we'll have to see. There's a lot of variables there. Uh, so it's hard to predict. After this, I'm going to go and look up the various export numbers currently for China and the U.S. and Latin America. I honestly don't know what they are currently.
Very good. Let's change a little bit the topic to cryptocurrency. Jack asked, will Bitcoin become a big player in U.S.-China trade?
Well, I'll give you some opinions, but if I was really an expert on Bitcoin, I'd be a Bitcoin millionaire right now, right? And I am not. So that shows what a lack of an expert I am on Bitcoin. The cryptocurrency in general is an interesting thing that, again, I'm no way an expert on. China is looking to develop its own sort of government-run cryptocurrency. I think the two interesting questions there so far are one, just allow them to have more control over the population by being able to keep an eye on what people are spending and how they're spending and all that kind of thing. But two, it may allow them to do more targeted Keynesian policy. Keynes, the economist, that is when you get into rough times like in 2008, and at the time China did a lot of stimulus. You can do stimulus with cryptocurrency, and China's even talked about this. They'd have it expire at a certain time, so you have to spend it or lose it. They'd actually provide people the money, and you'd have to spend it or lose it. So if you hit a big recession, then you have to spend it. But if you didn't, then you wouldn't be able to spend it a year from now. So it would be really targeted stimulus. And then the third thing, you keep hearing two people talk about it allow them to replace the US dollar as a world reserve currency. That I don't think will happen with a Chinese cryptocurrency or with RMB until China is willing to open up, to liberalize. A world reserve currency would not be one that's like in China where people have to worry about getting their money out of the country. So I don't think that'll happen until the other happens.
I know that in 2017 there was a crackdown on cryptocurrency in China, but a few days ago, the governor of the People's Bank of China actually called cryptocurrency an investment alternative. Um, and so that's raising a lot of eyebrows. And so, in fact, it was said that they're considering right now how to regulate it to prevent speculation of such assets that would cause financial stability risks. So it sounds like China, like the U.S. and other countries, are trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'm trying to figure it out as well. I'm not even a country.
Me as well. It's fascinating though. Here's a little bit of a we are getting close to the end here, but we were having questions on COVID, and since COVID is huge in business and trade, um, the question and I know Vietnam is close to both you and I. You're doing programs in Vietnam with Highline, and we're doing a program on May 12th with Vietnam. So please keep your eyes open for that. Um, but uh, why? The question is why was Vietnam so successful in containing the pandemic early on?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. And a bunch of countries were successful that you wouldn't have guessed at. And I think the honest answer is we don't know for sure yet. There could be a variety of variables, but there's been a number of possibilities. One is most of the countries that dealt with SARS back in 2003, I think that was. I happened to be in China at the time that SARS broke out. Had a cold on the way home on the flight, and then I got pink eye, and I tried to go to work, and the HR person told me nobody wants you here, so I had to self quarantine back then, much less quarantining now. I did not have SARS, but anyway, I experienced
Right.
SARS personally. I happened to be there when it was happening. But all these countries, whether Taiwan or Vietnam or other countries, most have been pretty successful, and because they got ready for these kinds of outbreaks because of SARS. And Vietnam, like China, has a government that was really able to the three big things that you want to do to contain COVID-19, we know contain any kind of an outbreak historically, that we did not do in the United States and Europe did not do well enough, is you want to test, you want to trace, and then you want to centrally quarantine. And with a government like Vietnam's or China's, the centrally quarantine is much easier to do with a authoritarian government.
Right.
And in Vietnam, they tested, and then they traced very well. And then they didn't, unlike here, if you tested positive and you just went back to your house, then you're just spreading it to other people in your family, including if you're in a community where there's a lot more people living in a house. It's sort of an idiotic thing to do. In Vietnam, they had central quarantine areas. So if you tested positive, you went to a central quarantine area until you were then clear. And that way they were able to stop the spread. There's other possibilities that there's some sort of immunity to it because of other coronaviruses that have spread. And there's some initial studies that show that might be a possibility. But I wrote it in my International Need to Know newsletter in March of 2020, so over a year ago. It's maybe the only wise thing I've written in that newsletter. I said, I think over time we're going to learn a lot more about this than we do now. We're going to be, what we think we know now is going to end up being wrong after we've had a lot of longitudinal and other studies done.
Uh, I know from personal experience, we were doing our Vietnam event in May of last year after COVID broke, and during our practice session, the factory manager had somebody come and put a gun to his head, a temperature gun. They check every hour, well, every day, multiple times a day. It was very impressive. The factory was being checked all the time. And also our consultant, who's now in Vietnam, looking at the process by which he had to go there, was very thorough. He had a test before he went, and then he got there, and he got sprayed over with some disinfectant, computer backpack and all, and then he was put in a quarantine in a two-star hotel and charged five-star rates. But it was a very thorough. He couldn't leave his room for so many days. The restrictions are very serious.
We did
Also,
not do any of that here.
right, right, and also we have postponed our trip to Vietnam. We are doing a trade mission. It is now scheduled for November, which I think we will be able to do. That the key is that we do not want to go into 2 weeks of quarantine. So once we're watching the regulations in Vietnam, but my expectation is that by that time we will have our vaccines, and hopefully we will be able to get into Vietnam without quarantine. But
I'm hoping to go there in December. If you're still in quarantine, I'll come by and say hello to you.
come and release us. All right, very good. Well, we are on time, and I think at this point um, I'd like to just give you a couple minutes, Sam, summary of your recommendations to President Biden on trade policy. How do we change it to make it better for all of us involved in business and trade?
Well, I think some things he said I think are going to be good. So I think the multilateral approach is the approach to do. I do think at some point we need to get rid of the tariffs. You know, I can see why they want to use them for leverage for now, but you know, tariffs are not an effective approach. And I do think we need to do a multilateral approach, but I do think we need to push back on China on their economic coercive policies. But we need to do that working with Japan and parts of Europe and other allies and like-minded partners. Um, I think also we should work to try and get back in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we should work to make Asia successful. I think I'm working on a new book now, and I'll talk about this in that book, but among many other things. But I think Vietnam is one of the 5 most important countries in the world. I can explain that at some other time. So trying to work with these countries to help them be successful, I think is important. Uh, I do. It's not a trade policy thing. I won't go into detail because I know this is a business organization. But I do think we should raise human rights more assertively with China for a variety of reasons, and happy to talk about that offline with people. And I think we can even cooperate in places with China, climate change being one of them. I know there's a climate summit going on now as we speak. In my book, I actually make a specific recommendation on something that China and the US could do together on climate change. So I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will do a lot of these things. And again, also we need to improve our own country and in a variety of recommendations to do that, not all of which I've gone through in this talk.
Very good. Well, thank you, Sam. It's been fun, and I'm going to tune in on April 28th at the Washington State China Relations Council event to hear more and perhaps ask more questions. Thank you to our co-organizers, the World Affairs Council, and especially to the great PR committee that allowed us to get over 100 registrants today. To the World Trade Center sponsors, to World Trade Center Tacoma sponsors, as well as today's co-promotional sponsors. And do remember that we will have another business and trade webinar in Vietnam on May 12th at 7 p.m. We hope to see you there, and you can register at our website. And we will see you all again next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Feel free to come to China Relations Council next week.